Decap Attack ripped off its own head and jammed it into your Sega Genesis back in 1991. Developed by Vic Tokai and published by Sega, Decap Attack is actually a complete reskinning of a Japanese game by the name of Magical Hat, which itself was based off a popular anime series. But with Sega not being able to secure the rights to publish Magical Hat in the States, they decided to simply remake the entire game into what we know as Decap Attack. So was Decap Attack worth the effort of completely remaking a game from the ground up just so Sega could get it on store shelves here in the West? Or should Sega have left well enough alone and just left Magical Hat to stay put in Japan? Well, grab your favorite decapitated skull, because we're about to see if Decap Attack is worth losing your head over. Start up Decap Attack and you're treated to a brief story cinematic where Dr. Frank N. Stein and his assistant Igor have reanimated a corpse called Chuck D. Bone to do battle with the evil Max D. Cap, oh my god, these names, who has risen from the underworld to take over the surface world. To do so, he separates your skeleton continent into several islands, and it's now up to you to go to each island to get them back together. Yes, the story is ridiculous, but you should have known what you were getting into when you wanted to play a game called Decap Attack. After the story scene, you can check out a few options or just start the game, which is what we're gonna do right now. Once you're in the game, you'll probably need a second or two to take in what you're even looking at. No, that weird stump-looking mummy thing isn't an enemy. That's actually Mr. Chuck D. Bone himself. If you can stop laughing long enough at the crack pipe nightmare that's on your screen, then it's probably best to actually start trying to play the game. Yes, we're once again looking at a side-scrolling action platformer here, but at least Decap Attack goes out of its way to make things as weird and crazy as possible. Long gone is the colorful, cute anime stylings that Magical Hat was in Japan, and is now replaced with a character whose main attack is literally a face shooting out of his chest cavity. As odd as it sounds, and looks, it's actually pretty effective, with its only issue being that it never seems to go quite as far as you need it to go. Combine this with Chuck's slippery inertia, and you'll usually end up running into enemies before your chest face can actually hit them. As amazing as having an exploding chest cavity as an attack is, you'll also be able to find your actual head hidden around stages as well. Once acquired, you'll be able to throw it at enemies, giving you an actual decap attack that lets you mow down just about everything in one hit with it. Flinging your head around is really fun and satisfying, though you'll have to wait a second or two for it to fly back to you every time you toss it at something. Take one hit from an enemy though, and it's gone until you can find it again, which unfortunately doesn't come up too often. Though I guess if it did, the game would be even easier than it already is. Along with finding your head, you'll also find various power-ups hidden in statues around each stage, which you can collect and use when you need them. To do so, you'll need to head into an inventory screen where you can see what you've collected, and ask for a description of what they even do. Most are just temporary buffs like running faster or a longer attack, and each one only lasts a few seconds before they're gone. Most of the time though, you'll forget they're even there since you have to access the inventory screen just to use them, and none are really useful enough to use outside of boss fights since you'll usually be too busy making your way around whatever stage you're on to notice or care. Speaking of stages, Decap Attack features 7 different worlds with 3 stages apiece to make your way through. And since this is a Genesis platformer, it's a safe bet that just about every stage is gonna be one of those large maze-like stages that everyone hates. Honestly, they're not as bad as some Sega-published games, but there are definitely times when you'll find yourself circling back around to places you've already been, since stages can go off in any variety of directions, along with multiple paths through them. Decap Attack is at its worst on the stages that rely on exact platforming, which is one area where Chuck D. Bone does not excel at with his overly floaty jumping and slippery running. Thankfully, these don't come up too often, and you're left with a good variety of stages to run around in, even if they can all start to look a little too much like each other after a while. You do at least get a bonus stage after each level if you can find it, where you can use your coins that you've collected to place multiple Chucks on different paths at the bottom of the screen that they'll follow to the top and collect power-ups or one-ups. It's not exactly fun or anything, but it gives you something to do between stages. Overall, Decap Attack stages are fairly lengthy and fun to explore, especially if you enjoy large open levels. If not, then you may want to steer clear of Decap Attack. The enemies that you'll be facing off within those stages are sadly pretty lame compared to just how crazy the rest of the game is. This is definitely one area where Decap Attack really dropped the ball, since you'd expect super crazy enemies that are as equally insane as the character you play as. Instead, you get stuff like small green blobs with arrow hats and ducks. These various platform enemy rejects are mostly used as small obstacles that will occasionally trip you up rather than anything you need to be careful around, as they just sort of wander around the stage with no rhyme or reason. The only time they become an issue is when the game suddenly decides to become a giant asshole and places them in spots where it's almost impossible to avoid taking damage from them. Most of the time though, it's best just to avoid them and continue making your way to the end of the stage. Bosses also make an appearance at the end of most of the worlds, and unlike the standard enemies, certainly live up to the rest of the game's insanity, though none are really challenging besides just trying to get Chuck close enough to hit him if you don't have your head to toss at him. Still though, it's always fun to see just what twisted creature the game will throw at you at the end of any given world. Decap Attack is one of those games where when you look at it, you know it could have only existed in a very specific time period. The early 90s was such a weird and wonderful time for kids, since it seemed toy manufacturers and game developers were throwing out whatever fever dreams they could imagine and then just seeing if kids liked it. Decap Attack is a perfect example of that. I mean, Sega could have just as easily did a basic reskinning of the original Japanese release and called it a day. Instead, they made a game about a mummy that has a face in its chest and throws its head at stuff. That's a special kind of crazy right there. Beyond the insanity of it all though, Decap Attack is still a pretty fun game. It can feel overly floaty and cheap at times, but the overall game is so weird and charming that it's hard to hate. If you can manage to find Decap Attack for a decent price, I think it's totally worth adding to your Genesis collection, and is a great game to make friends gawk and laugh at when you pull it out, especially at Halloween. In the end, Decap Attack may not make you lose your head over it, but it's definitely one of the more unique and strange games on the Genesis to check out if you've never played it.